Hi, everybody. I see that we have 35 people here, which is really lovely and astonishing. So, first of all, thank you so much to everyone who's in attendance. I know this is a weird and complicated and challenging time in so many ways for so many folks. And so we're just really grateful that you guys are here to convene with us. And of course, we're especially grateful to our three fabulous panelists who have such a collective wealth of expertise and grace. And we're just really, really appreciative that you guys were willing to take the time to be with us tonight. I'm Julia Obert. I guess I should say that. I'm a professor in the UW English department. And I'm convening our Think and Drink tonight because I am also a member of the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research's steering committee, executive committee, whatever we're calling it now. Our director, Scott Hinkle, is here. He is muted and invisible, but his hand guides all insofar as things humanities are concerned. So Scott, thanks for being kind of the overarching organizer of all of this. So without further ado, let me introduce our three panelists in turn. First, we have Mary Burman with us, who is a professor of nursing with expertise in primary care and public health, especially in rural areas. Mary was Dean of Nursing at UW for 11 years. I'm sure many of you guys know her. And having recently returned to the faculty, she's now examining the impact of World War I on nursing, healthcare, and communities, including collective grief. So awfully topical for us just now, Mary. Matt Gray, our second panelist, has been a professor in the UW Psychology Department for 18 years. Matt trained at the National Center for PTSD and the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center, and his clinical and research areas are post-traumatic stress, with particular emphasis on sexual assault and domestic violence. And Matt also told me to note that despite his expertise, he's just sort of faking and fumbling his way through quarantine like everyone else, and that most of what he knows about navigating our current circumstances comes from memes. So we're all in this together. Experts, they're just like us. And finally, our third panelist is Jess Ryan. Jess is a mental health therapist at Wyoming Art Therapy and Medical Counseling, and also the creator of ourrealwork.com, where she walks with people through the journeys of major life transitions. Using evidence-based tools from mental health therapy, ancestral and collective trauma healing, somatic work, shamanic studies, as well as other evidence-based practices like mindfulness and yoga, she helps people do the real work of healing and discovering their most authentic selves. So Jess, Matt, and Mary, thank you guys so much for being here. So our topic for tonight, as you guys probably already know, is healing individuals, healing communities. And I'm kind of thinking of this as like our crisis era edition of Think and Drink. I picked the topic because on the one hand, I didn't want to be Pollyanna-ish. I mean, I know that we're all just completely consumed by all things COVID. But on the other hand, I've been feeling, I think, so sort of reactive, like everything is just coming at us in this very immediate sort of way. And I wanted to kind of stop and just take a slightly longer view tonight to think about, you know, when we're kind of on the other side of this, as it were, how we might heal, how we might repair, and what kinds of possible futures we might envision. I think obviously this is a time of great trauma and stress and injury and difficulty, but I sort of wanted to think about the other side of that as well. Is there anything positive or productive that might emerge from this present moment? So unfortunately for all of you guys, though, in order to talk about healing, first we have to talk about trauma for a while. So we're going to start with a few questions about that, and then maybe about halfway through, I'll try to kind of rotate the conversation 180 degrees, and hopefully we can think a little bit about healing and repair. So with that being said, if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat all the way through. We'll take probably the first 45 minutes or so to have our kind of convened discussion. And then I'll turn to the chat and I'll pull a few questions out of there so we can have some sort of interchange with the folks in attendance. So, okay, let's get started. So I wanted to start by asking, I mean, I think we're all, fairly familiar with the concept of trauma as it exists on an individual level. But I was curious if in your view and if in your work, if you think there's such a thing as collective trauma. And if so, are we suffering from it right now in our present moment of global pandemic? And whoever wants to go first, please just hop on in.
We're all looking at you, Matt, like you're just ready to say something.
I was trying to be deferential to the expertise of the rest of the panel. Certainly, it would be hard to argue that the significant loneliness and sadness and anxiety that I think we're all experiencing right now, significant apprehensions, aren't traumatic. The thing about trauma is one of those words, I think, that lots of people use in a lot of different ways. And I think if we're using it sort of informally as acknowledgement of real pain and real anxiety right now, it's totally appropriate and totally reasonable. I caution a little bit, though, sometimes about uses of trauma descriptively, because what I sometimes worry about is that we can pathologize normal emotion, that we have real anxiety and sadness that we should experience in response to some harrowing events and some harrowing circumstances. And we need to allow for that. And we need to have some grace and self-compassion to allow ourselves to sort of wallow a bit without feeling like it's something to be tamped down or contained or solved quickly, because what we're experiencing is probably appropriate to the circumstances. But I don't think we need to worry about long-term widespread COVID-19 PTSD for years to come.
Well, I can chime in. I think that there is something called collective I've looked less at trauma and more at grief. And I think there is something, and if you probably, many of you have been reading these reports. The New York Times has had a number of stories on, people dying alone in the hospital. The chaplain can't come in, the family can't come in. Afterwards, they're having, I think this was in Italy or Spain, they were having drive-by funerals where there could only be like 3 people there. So those normal sort of rituals and cultural things that we do around death and dying, grief, illness, I think have been, they're sort of on hold right now. And so I think that those cultural things really do speak to a cultural kind of, maybe a bit of trauma, and I'll defer to Matt on that because he knows more about that than me, but I certainly do think it does lead to something about collective grief. We're grieving together about the loss of normal cultural routines. And I think that is a challenge for us to deal with right now. How do we establish new kinds of things to deal with death right now? If you can't be with your family member, you can't have a funeral afterwards, or you have a virtual funeral, or you have a drive-by funeral. Really a challenge to think about how we replace those with some things in the short term that do allow us to do the things that we normally do when we're stressed, when we're confronted with challenging things, severe illness, death, and dying, and so forth. So I think there is a collective grief right now in a lot of ways. We've been hit a little less hard in Wyoming with only 2 deaths, but even just looking at what's happening in New York City is enough to make me grieve for those who are having to go through those kind of things. Again, the loss of cultural rituals and norms, I think, lead to that collective grief.
Yeah, Mary. Jess, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be here with both you, Matt and Mary. And so like in the various, ways that I work with people, whether that's through like energetic work, whether that's as a therapist, and I do a lot of trauma work with people and in their systems. And so sometimes we use the definition of like trauma is just anything that overwhelms the system. the system's coping strategy. And as Matt noted, like, it's a little overwhelming right now. And, you know, over the past few weeks, I've had numerous clients come to me and they're like, I feel like I'm in survival mode and I don't know why. Like, I'm fine. I have a roof over my head. I'm still getting a paycheck. Like, and I can't, like, I feel like I'm in, like, sort of just making it through. And the interesting thing, you know, about our brains is, like, the part of our brain that deals with self-regulation is very social, right? Like, that's the part, it's formed in connection with interpersonal, you know, interaction. And as, like, Daniel Siegel says, we sort of, like, co-regulate, and trauma or anything that overwhelms the system is, of course, going to, like, hit on that part of our brain. And then we also, you know, co-regulate together. And I think we have a hard time as human beings. We're still connected. Some, I think, can sense people more than others, you know, from distances, but we're still used to the, like, oh, my loved one is in this space, like 1,500 miles away, and I have a sense of, like, what's happening with them. And I think in this collective, we're a lot more attuned and connected than we think we are. Yeah. And there is this, like, sympathetic resonance that happens. And as, you know, Mary was speaking to that collective grief, we might not be experiencing that in the acute, like, huge phases. And it's still, like, it's impacting us. And so how do we recognize, you know, how do we recognize that? And if we don't recognize it, it just feels maddening in a lot of ways.
Totally. That's, I'm so impressed by you guys already. You guys are brilliant. So that kind of alley-oops me right into my next question. So thanks, Jess. I was interested to know what you guys think is maybe the single best thing, or a couple of things that we can do for each other right now. And whether that's for specific individuals or for our community here in Laramie or beyond, during this time of suffering, trauma, potentially collective grief at least. And, you know, I've been thinking a lot about the fact that so much of what we usually do to comfort each other involves physical proximity, right? And that's something that's been sort of cruelly wrenched away from us just now. And so I'm wondering, you know, how can we kind of compensate for the fact that we're largely unable to provide those comforts of immediacy and proximity for each other during the pandemic?
Well, you know, I'll defer a little bit to Jess and Matt because they know more about counseling than I do. But, you know, one of the things that really struck me about this, and a thing that I think everybody can probably do, given our place in Wyoming, there's a growing body of literature that talks about health and nature. And we're in a perfect setting to be able to think about that piece of it. The data is interesting. It's not as robust as you'd like, but there's still enough there that would suggest that there's a lot of positive impacts of it. So for example, it can decrease blood pressure. It can, if you're out in nature, and I think about not just outside, but out in nature, looking at streams, rivers, trees, mountains, whatever, it can affect your immune response. There's some preliminary data that shows that it might actually decrease cortisol levels, improve your sleep, possibly decrease things like anxiety and depression. So I really think people, because of our setting, one of the things that we can do, and given social and physical distancing, we actually have the benefit of being able to get out and get a dose of nature that may actually be something right now that could be really, really appropriate. We live right near Laprelle Park. There are antelope in that park, there are beavers, there are blue herons right now up at the end, the sort of east end of it, rabbits. The trees are going to be starting to leaf out. There's even some evidence that suggests that if your life is a bit crazy right now and you can't get out, even if you look at pictures of nature or look out your window, even for a few minutes, and it doesn't have to be a big dose. Some of the evidence shows it could even be as little as 5 minutes, some 15 minutes. It's a very simple thing, but I think this is one of the advantages of being in Wyoming. We could actually all give ourselves a dose of nature that might actually have a positive impact, and it's fairly low risk. I mean, if you've been sedentary all winter and decide you're going to go climb a 14er down in Colorado, that's a problem. But if you're going to walk through, you know, Laprelle Park or Labonte Park, or go up to Tie City and hike on one of the trails, it's pretty low risk, as long as you feel safe, and if you socially distance appropriately, physically distance appropriately. Nice way to give yourself a nice dose of something that might be really positive right now.
Yeah, that's lovely, Mary. And if it would stop freaking snowing, that would that would occasion our
spring will come eventually.
Jess or Matt, anything else you guys want to add?
I guess I would just say, well, first of all, speaking of Wyoming snow, I have a much more scenic Zoom space, and it's my front porch, but Wyoming forced me down into my Zoom basement bunker for this, unfortunately. I guess I would say you're absolutely right, Julie, about physical proximity can't fully be replicated, and that's something that's been wrested from us, and that's something that's particularly tragic about the current moment. I would say that we're in a moment of forced reflection, and I would say that we all, I think, have that sense of like, oh, if I ever have time, I'm going to call that friend from high school or college, I'm going to reconnect with this person, I'm going to spend more time with these people that are not in our local community, and we just keep kicking that can down the road, and we never take advantage of those opportunities. I think it's not especially surprising or insightful to say that this is a moment where we could actually do that, but I think we can very easily underestimate the value and benefit of doing that. This is a time where we really do need that social connectivity, and it might be one of the rare moments where we have the time and the space that we can actually connect with other people that we've sort of been estranged from for other reasons in our mobile and geographically dispersed society. So I think people should, if they've been on the fence about doing that, certainly take advantage of that. And then the other thing that I would say, I guess, is even though it's difficult in the present moment while we're still in quarantine and still in this really difficult space to like force gratitude and force growth and all of those sorts of things that sometimes people are trying to force down your throat with memes like, oh, are you growing enough? Are you like cultivating gratitude? It's like, give people a minute. Can you give people some time to just experience what they're experiencing before we like force them onto the growth edge? But we can begin to sort of plant some seeds. We can take stock of what we're missing and what we now recognize is really critical and really valuable, and we can kind of begin to make commitments about how we want to live our lives and what kind of connections we want to make and what kind of social presence we want to have once this phase is over. And I think that reflection can ultimately pay dividends.
Yeah, I love that. And hopefully we'll be able to kind of take some of this forward. I mean, I also worry that like when we're on the far side of this, that we'll forget all of the lessons that we learned and just sort of go back to our ordinary lives. But, you know, I think it's worth just sort of taking this as a moment of pause and thinking about like, how do we want to change? Even if we can't muster gratitude every day or whatever, like
historians would say that we will surely learn this and never forget it. We never forget historical lessons.
Exactly. Jess, what do you suggest?
Yeah, so piggybacking off of these two amazing humans, Mary, you know, talking about that nature aspect, and we are in that a perfect space to do that, and then bringing in sort of the mental, emotional, spiritual aspect. There is something also too, and when we're in the natural world, and I know this to be true for me, but in the moments where we feel isolated, like I am separate from everybody else, I have nothing, I don't have this or that, when we're in nature and immersed in nature, it's hard not to feel part of a collective. Like there is a pulse that runs through. The sun comes up, the moon does its thing, the birds come and go in their own sort of cycle of things. And I think, you know, being able to be in a space where we can actually slow down to the rhythm of nature and be in that speaks to some sort of archetypal level of like, I belong, like I belong. And I think that that's so many people right now are feeling so isolated or like they don't belong, or that they don't have whatever that is. And so, you know, kind of adding to that, when we can get into nature, that aspect of belonging at a deep level. And and also too, you know, just going back to that question of like, what can we do for each other? We're not physically close, you know, we can be in these spaces, and even in these spaces, sometimes there's like, okay, it's another Zoom call. And I'm actually very excited to be on this Zoom call. But I also, you know, going to what Matt was saying, and that letting people just be where they're at, like, it's okay. It's not pathology that we're sad. It's not bad that, and I think sometimes people feel bad about that in themselves. And I think one of the things we can do for each other is to be with people, whether that's in a phone call, whether that's through a text, whether that's seeing someone struggling on Facebook, and not trying to make it go away, and not trying, but just being like, I see you, like, I see you and I am here with you. And that also goes to that, like, the parts of our brain that are impacted by trauma or impacted, you know, by overwhelm, and how can we cultivate that ability within ourselves, in presence within ourselves, to just be with,
Yeah.
however that is.
The only other thing I would add to it, and it builds off something that Matt said, I think this is a time for reflection, particularly for those who have the time to do it. And I realize there are families out there where you've got people working either at home or outside who don't have the luxury of a lot of extra time. But the other thing I would add to that, because I think it's really critical right now to think about, is how we can all serve. And I think people are doing that. I mean, this whole just this incredible process of people making masks, for example. And that may be your calling, but your calling may be, as Matt said, to call somebody you haven't talked to for a while, to provide some sort of service or donation to a nonprofit in town. The nonprofits right now are going to be serving long past any sort of peak with coronavirus. The nonprofits are going to be dealing with the economic change across the country, and particularly in Wyoming. We look at the budget forecast for the state of Wyoming, and it's not pretty, on top of the COVID-19. So I think maybe your calling is to do something for a nonprofit. Maybe it's to wave across the porch to the person who's a neighbor who's alone and needs somebody. So think about ways. I think it helps us at a time like this to find those ways that we can serve in some way. We can look to others to do something for others, so it isn't just focused on ourselves. And I do think we have to have our own meltdowns about this. Why the heck do I have to stay in my room when I'm sick and tired of not being able to go to the coffee shop and get my, you know, latte or whatever? We do have to have those moments, and they're normal and acceptable. But I think to help us move beyond that, think about ways we can serve, and we can serve others as well in this time, I think is really critical. And I think it's part of that moving in a way beyond, we've got this collective grief. How do we begin to then move past that? I don't know if we move past the collective grief. How do we begin to reinstitute a way of collective dealing with this particular crisis right now?
Yeah, I mean, I've even been thinking about just like vocalizing cues that I usually use body language for, because first of all, when we're apart, I mean, at least 6 feet distant from each other, there are certain cues that you just literally can't see, you can't pick up on. And then when people are wearing masks, I mean, you have this experience of, I mean, we're supposed to, right? But everyone sort of, it feels menacing, right? Because you can't see people's facial expressions and smiles. And so I've been personally just trying to vocalize those gestures a little bit more explicitly. And, you know, I think maybe for me, that's something I'll take forward just in my personal interactions in and around town anyway. So, okay, we've answered the question sort of, you know, what we can do for each other right now. And I kind of wanted to turn to what do you guys think we can do when the immediate threat of the pandemic has passed? So what does your work suggest that we will need to do, both, you know, as individuals, as local communities, and indeed as a national and a global community to heal? And then when I sent out my questions a little bit ahead of time, Jess said, well, it would be really helpful for us to talk about, like, what does healing mean before we answer that question. So maybe we could kind of build that into some of our responses as well. Like, how do you and how does your work define what healing is, what it entails exactly? Because I guess we need to be able to envision what that looks like before we can think about moving toward it. So, two-part question, I guess. It's kind of a big one, so sorry.
I'm sort of looking at Jess. How do you see healing, Jess?
Yeah, again, complicated questions, big questions. And I think healing, the definition for me personally has changed over the years. I think just as I've experienced life. But I think about this a lot as I see like clients who want to come in and they want to feel different, or they want something to be healed, right? And so kind of thinking about that word and thinking about like a cure is different than healing. And like sometimes we want things to look pretty and neat and boxed, and that's the healing, but that's maybe not healing. Healing's messy sometimes, a lot of times, and things often don't look the same way they did when they came in the door. Whether that's like I had an injury and my physical body needs to heal. Who am I after that process of healing and through the process of healing? And so I don't have, I also do really well speaking in the gray space. So I don't have a definitive sort of like, what is healing? Like, oh, we're going to have this utopian sort of like, we're going to learn from all of the things. That would be great. And, I don't know, like I have a hunch some things are going to go back. People are going to click back into their tracks. People are going to be changed. It's like the whole spectrum of all of it. And what is that new amalgam of all of that going to look like? I don't know. And so that is my answer. That's my answer, Mary.
Well, and I don't know that I have an answer either. I've been thinking about a concept. I think she's a psychologist, wrote an interesting article about what happened after 9/11. Of course, there was this whole, what should we do with that site? And so there was a lot of back and forth controversy about it, a lot of discussion about that. And her argument was we can't just rebuild, we have to move beyond this in a way of developing new sort of structures around community and community engagement that will help us heal what happened after 9/11. She talks about something called memorializing, which is again sort of getting back to this notion of shared meaning, collective grieving, joint action around things. And I've been thinking about it as Julie said at the beginning, I've got this total fascination with World War I. My grandmother and great aunt served as nurses in France in 1918, 1919. So I've spent way too much time looking and thinking about World War I. But one of the interesting things about it is in my travels, I began to notice that everywhere you go, there's a World War I memorial. We have one in Laramie, in fact. People probably don't realize that. There's one on the corner of the courthouse. I think it's on the northeast corner of it. It's a World War I memorial. And there are memorials everywhere, from tiny little villages in Scotland to Cape Breton to, there's quite an interesting memorial in Kenya, in Nairobi. There are huge memorials. The Teep Vale Memorial on the Somme battlefield is this gigantic, colossal, I've never seen anything like it. It's the size of a building, but it's a memorial and has all the names of some almost 74,000 troops that were never found after the war. They don't have any idea what happened to them. Their bodies were never recovered. So there's all this focus on memorializing, and I'm not sure that we need to build memorials after COVID-19. But World War I, there's a lot of instructive things I think that can come out of that, of people getting together to do something. It's a bit like the AIDS, those of you that were around during the early phases of AIDS, we had an AIDS quilt that went across the country. I read an interesting article not too long ago about a woman. There was some sort of soccer catastrophe or football catastrophe in England where some stands or something fell down, a bunch of people died. I don't know a lot about it, but they had a collective funeral book. So people would come and write their comments about their perception of what happened. and I'm not, I work more with a sense of communities because my background's in public health than I do with individuals. So I think about it in a collective way. I think we need to think about those kind of things. And again, it may not be building a memorial. I'm not arguing for that, but I think those memorials brought people together. You look at the one in Laramie, it was Grace, what's her name? Grace Heber or something. I can't remember her whole name. She and Edward Ivinson got together and decided in the early 20s that they should do something. So they bring the community in, they identified everybody that was a soldier in World War I, and they build a memorial around it. What are ways we can do that? The other thing that I keep going back to, I had the incredible opportunity to teach a study abroad course last summer on war, and we actually spent 3 weeks in England and France and went to the unbelievable and amazing, absolutely amazing cemeteries in northern France. Oh, here, somebody put it in there. Grace Raymond Hebert, I couldn't think of her whole name. These cemeteries are unbelievable. And what's interesting about them is that they were clearly a way to bring people together after the war, bury the dead. But what's interesting about them is that they relate to the future as well, the present. So it's interesting when you go to those cemeteries. I don't know anybody that died that was in these cemeteries, but you walk into them, there's this quiet, they're bucolic, they're actually right along the front in the Somme battlefield. They're in farm fields, there's corn growing around them, but they are beautifully maintained. They have flowers. You all of a sudden have this sense of the incredible disparity between what that looked like when it was no man's land in World War I and what it looks like now. And it brings this past into the future in an interesting way that I think those probably in the past were hoping would happen, that the stories of these men and women who were killed, it's mostly men, but there are actually British nurses buried in some of these cemeteries. It actually brings that past to the present. And again, for those in the past that hope that these stories would never be lost are still retained. And so actually in the last month, I've been thinking a lot about this. I don't know that I have any particularly profound ideas, but I do think it's important to start thinking about that. What do we want to do? There's the Kaiser Health Foundation, Kaiser Family Foundation, and I think it's Guardian are partnering, and they're already starting, I can't remember what they're calling it, but it's a way to memorialize the healthcare professionals who are dying right now in COVID-19. What do we want to do as a community? What in Laramie would make sense for us to memorialize this time, in the sense that memorializing is a process of collective grief, of coming together and sharing, developing a shared meaning and a way to move forward beyond it. What would make sense for us to do? And like I said, I don't know that I have profound ideas, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. There will be similar things that we need to do as a collective, I think, as well as what we might need to do as an individual, depending on our response to all of it.
So excellent insights and observations, Mary and Jess. I probably don't have anything particularly poignant to add to that. Those were really well articulated. But in terms of what healing looks like, I mean, a number one principle in trauma treatment is you can't truly begin to heal until there is objective safety. And so we work with people who are experiencing ongoing trauma at the individual level, and we can work with them with coping and, distress tolerance and managing some things. But in terms of like really healing from trauma, the trauma has to be resolved. And so there will be a period probably before too long where we're reopening the economy and we get not quite an all clear, but people are going to be like testing the waters a little bit. But I think it's going to be a good while after that people aren't going to be super anxious about contagion, and there's going to be real sense of vulnerability economically and otherwise. And I think that's going to be with us for a little while, and that's not easily resolved even when we get to a place where there is cure or vaccine or what have you. So that will take some time. I think in terms of true growth and in terms of true healing, there's a short-term phase and a long-term phase. And I actually think the short-term phase is a little bit easier. Emotions have informational value. And negative emotions and painful emotions, they communicate to us what we've lost, what is important, what's meaningful. And I think everyone is going to be able to appreciate that and have those insights. I think real growth and real change and real healing requires vigilance and attention and energy. I think everyone's had at the individual level an experience of going to a funeral. And unless it's somebody that's like an immediate family member, somebody that's like really, really close, I think when we go to funerals, we all have this sense of reflection of mortality, and we have this sense of what's important in life, and we make these commitments to ourselves about how we're going to live differently and what we're going to prioritize. And then 2 weeks later, we're fighting on the internet with somebody we don't even know about the dumbest, most vapid things you could imagine. And so I think these painful moments easily cultivate awareness and meaning, but true culture change and cultural growth and collective growth requires us not only to be aware of what's important, but to make individual commitments to honoring those. And so I really like what Mary had to say about giving to local nonprofits. People think about it forever. They don't actually do it. Doesn't have to be money. It can be time, supporting with gift certificates or what have you, local businesses right now. And I hope we don't have this like moment where we right now recognize non-glamorous essential workers and acknowledge their sacrifice and their commitment and what they're being asked to do right now. I hope it makes us think longer term about who's important in our society and people that we've maybe overlooked, and really being cognizant of that, and being more respectful of things that perhaps we've overlooked. But that requires energy and sustained attention and commitment.
Yeah, that's I mean, really wonderful responses from all of you. And I mean, all of these things about shared narrativizing of a traumatic event. I mean, that's so much in the restorative justice literature. I mean, it's interesting when the quote unquote enemy is sort of it's something external rather than, you know, we're trying to heal a rupture between two communities or two groups. But yeah, I think that commitment to shared storytelling, to the kind of narrativizing that commits something to collective memory, is super important. And then making those commitments that come out of that form of memorialization, as you say, Matt, seems super important. And you know, that question of, you said vulnerability, and I've been trying to write about the pandemic as well right now, and you know, I've been reading Judith Butler's writing about vulnerability, and she theorizes vulnerability as kind of the very foundation of community. And I think that's so interesting, the ability to dwell with one's own vulnerability, and then to make that relational is such an interesting thing to think about right now. So, you know, but whatever, I'm not, I'm not one of the panelists, so we'll maybe come back to this. But I wanted to ask you guys, because I've been thinking about this too, right? So, you know, COVID, I would say maybe is one of the very first kind of truly universal, or at least like close to universal, sources of trauma that we've experienced in our lifetimes, trauma or grief, or however we're defining this kind of experience that we're having right now. And let me be really careful to disentangle, like, of course, this is not to say that it hasn't affected specific individuals and communities far more severely than others, right? So we'll put that up front and center, and a couple of questions have come up about that actually, so I think maybe we could talk more about that. But it is to say, though, that it has affected almost everyone on our planet, right? Which is like this really astonishing thing. And I think, Mary, World War I is such an interesting touchstone, because it feels like maybe sort of since the World Wars that something like this has been so kind of universally shared. And so if indeed the coronavirus is kind of a universal source of trauma, I wonder if it also potentially presents opportunities for more positive, widespread collectivism. And this is where I kind of wanted to turn to this question of possible futures, like what possible futures might we imagine coming out of this traumatic experience, with all of that kind of, in light of everything that I sort of just outlined.
We don't want to interrupt each other. You look like you're just poised again, Matt, to say something.
He's like, no.
Well, and of course, again, my background's in healthcare and public health, and I go back and forth between optimism and pessimism, I have to admit. When you think about where we're at in terms of this pandemic and I'll just be blunt, the profound lack of preparedness for it. it's stunning, to be quite truthful with you. And some of it certainly is the Trump administration. I don't mean to be political here, but there were certainly problems on the part of the Trump administration. But this is a long-term issue. This is not, this is, we have a crisis, we get fired up, we put money back into public health, we prepare preparedness plans and put them on the shelf thinking that the next time this comes around, we'll have a pattern for which we need to do, what we need to do for the next time this happens. And then those that we cut CDC, we cut public health departments, we forget about those reports that were on the shelf that outlined how best to respond to these kind of things. And I think we have a real reckoning in a lot of ways in our country. And again, my background's a bit different than Jess and Matt's. I think of this from a public health framework. We have a reckoning in terms of public health. We have got to take this opportunity and finally stick with it, and not gradually, you know, after a year or two, forget the lessons that we learned. Properly fund public health. We need the sort of surveillance monitoring systems in place so that we can track these. We need right now, for example, one of our biggest problems is the whole testing thing. And on top of that, we are woefully unprepared to do the contact tracing that needs to be done. That requires people. There are apps that people are talking about, and yes, there may be some benefit to those. I'm not an expert about that. But the reality is, even if you've got an app, you need to have those people in place. And you may be asking yourself, why is this relevant to a topic like this on sort of how we aggrieve and come to grips with this? But this is fundamental. The fact that we are unprepared means we have to take much more draconian action. It means there's much more uncertainty. You know, is this going to be a problem? Is it not? That consistent message about, yes, this is a new novel virus, but here's what we're doing, here's what's in place, is not happening. And that all accentuates the kind of things that we've been talking about, where people, again, are uncertain, they're fearful, they're scared, they don't know what to expect. So through my public health lens, I would argue that one of the things that needs to come out of this is a true commitment to public health in our country. Without it, we leave so much of other things vulnerable, like mental health systems and other kinds of things as well, and we increase the impact. So as I said, I go back and forth. At one point I think, oh, this is the time, we'll learn from this, we'll put it into place. And then you look back and think, well, past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, and realize that, oh my God, this happens over and over again, and we forget the lessons that we learned 10 years ago, 20 years ago. We forget those lessons, unfortunately. But I'll be an optimist, and maybe this will be the time we learn something. Yes, fingers, toes.
That certainly mirrors my own observations about this. I too was sort of like, I don't know if I want to give best case, worst case, and most likely case outcome of how this is going to play out. It depends. But you know, it's happy hour, and people are looking for growth and healing. So I'm going to go less worst case scenario. I do think we've sort of drifted as a society down this path, wittingly or unwittingly, of anti-intellectualism. And this is a moment where we can see the power of expertise and science and healthcare and how important those things are. And I would like to think, and I would hope, that this would be a moment where we return to societal emphasis on science and healthcare, and invest in science and healthcare, and heed the perspectives of scientists and healthcare professionals. So I think that could be a good outcome, and I hope that happens. And I, like you, don't want to get political, but it's hard to separate that out. It's hard to be completely apolitical in this moment, so I will not be partisan political. But I will say that elections have consequences. And one thing we need to do is quit being such a bunch of lazy babies come election time. We have half of our citizenry sitting home because they think everybody's just the same, or sitting home because their preferred candidate didn't get nomination. And whether you're a Trump backer or Obama fan, or whoever else, there will be policies made. There will be plans put in place and shelved. There will be people appointed to important positions. And the notion that these things happen at a 30,000-foot view and they won't impact me, it's all going to be the same. I don't think that's true. And I hope that this is a moment where we realize that that's not true and we begin to commit to electing people at the local and state and national level who emphasize our values around these types of things.
Thanks, Matt. Jess.
Yes. All right. I might just happy hour it. I don't with my you know, a mix of all of these things. Like, I feel like in some ways I am an eternal realist, sometimes pessimist. I see the dark side of a lot of things all the time. And in that, I think that gives me a lot of hope and moments of like eternal sort of like optimism for the greater flow of things, for the more meta perspective of it. And so in some ways, like, I think about this quote from, I think it's Thomas Hubel or something like that, where he's like, our greatest potential is in our deepest humanity, right? And like, there is this, as you were saying, Julia, there is this moment right now that is a little bit different in the way that we are experiencing something globally, right? Like, there's definitely been ways that we've experienced universal themes in different areas, but we're all kind of like collectively, globally going through something right now. The part of me that sees the dark and twisty all the time is like, sure, people are nothing's going to change, you know, like the curmudgeonly part of me. And there is something, and I think this also comes from my like energy worker and shamanic practices and earth-based practices, that's like some thread in the fabric is changing. And whether we see that in this lifetime, I don't know. You know, I think about, if you look at the earth, this is way, again, sort of like geological time frame. The earth has been the earth, whether we as human beings have been on it or not, right? It's like, we're definitely talking about our humanity right now. But there is some sort of pulse and cycle that continues through that innate wisdom and process and the science of it, which is like mind-blowing. And so I want to believe, maybe that's more it than anything, is that there is a thread in our collective consciousness that is being plucked. And whoever wants to resonate with that sympathetic resonance, whether we see that in this lifetime, I don't know. Whether that's going to be in some iteration when we are the way of the dinosaurs someday, it will play out later. I don't know. But those are kind of my musings on it when I don't want to be mired in the everyday grit of it. Just hang out here, global perspective. So I don't know. Another thought to just have a drink. Maybe that'll help.
No, I hope it's in our lifetime, Jess. I mean, I would love to see. I mean, I think you're right. I think there's sort of immediate resonances and then potentially long-term change that may or may not be prompted by kind of a collective shaking up like this. And yeah, I mean, I think actually there's a question in the Q&A here. We can kind of shift into that, but that I think sort of draws on some of the things that we were just talking about. And it's from Nick Murdoch, who he was asking about, and this is me thinking about, how can we use this moment for like potential immediate change, right? Or at least short to medium term change. And Nick was asking, and actually this is something that Mary as well down at the bottom of the chat was sort of drawing on as well. But he says, building on Mary's idea of service and collectivity, how can we use this time to address the structural inequalities that have been so strongly revealed by this medical and economic disaster? How can we help others? And I think, yeah, for me, like that's such an important question. Like, what kinds of structural change, like what futurities can we imagine that are other than our past, you know? Like, is this a moment at which our trajectory economically, socially, doesn't have to be linear because so many things are being interrupted, right? So I don't know, I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts about Nick's question.
Lots. I mean, I think COVID virus just exposes all the disparities in our society, in our healthcare system. I keep going back to that horrible tweet by that, I can't remember his name, Geffen or somebody like that, where he's self-isolating down on his yacht somewhere. And he posts this, and you're just thinking, you know, how tone deaf are you? I don't know that I have, you know, I think this is one of those, as we think about how we move forward, I think we have to acknowledge those things. We have to acknowledge those huge disparities in terms of who has access to healthcare, who has access to mental health services. They're huge, and coronavirus just totally exposes those. I didn't go off on my tirade, but those of you who know me will expect this from me. We have to fundamentally re-envision how we do healthcare. It's along with public health, but how we do primary care, how we do mental health services, how we integrate those, how we provide services that do recognize the differences between people, how we ensure everybody so that nobody is blocked from access to care. And I'll stop there, because if I go on further, I will go off on a major tirade that will destroy our happy hour here in a bad way.
That's a good gesture towards it, though, Mary. Thank you. Matt or Jess, any thoughts on that?
I guess I would just, you know, agree with that. It would be nice if we had a society where we mobilized and concerned ourselves with a small percentage of our population who have always been marginalized. And if that was enough to get societal fundamental change, that's what we should do as a society. If we care about each other and if we care about the collective, unfortunately, for whatever reason, it's not until enough people are impacted and there's enough adversity and enough insecurity and vulnerability for a large enough percentage of the population that people really get serious about change. And I would never be as glib as to talk about silver linings of coronavirus or anything like that, but I do think this is exposing that structural inequality. I do think it is speaking to and augmenting that disparity, and unfortunately, looking at our history, it's when enough people are impacted that we get serious about advocating and mobilizing social change. And I completely think I share Mary's soapbox passion and zeal for our healthcare system and changes that need to happen to make sure that we don't get good care and health and protection if we are in a privileged position to afford it.
For sure. Jess, anything? Or
No, I mean, like, preach. And I, you know, and then it just comes to like the next steps, right? Which I think is a question, like, I certainly do not look to me for an answer for this one. But like having that same question of just like, okay, so what are those in the practical next steps, while still allowing ourselves to be in the process state of this? And like, okay, it does come into politics, it does come into policy, it comes into what are the ways that we mobilize, what are the way that we hear the voices of those that are marginalized in this, right? Because like, even in this moment, my hunch is on the other side of this Zoom call, people probably look pretty similar and have similar backgrounds. And so how do we involve, and that's just a question, right? Like, just posing the question. I don't have the answer to that or anything really. So
well, you know, I mean, questions breeding more questions is an important part of this, I think, right? I don't think we expect anyone to have answers right in the throes of this thing, but more questions are good. by the way, that question came from Maggie Murdoch. I was corrected by Nick that she had appropriated his keyboard, so just to cite my sources appropriately. There's another great question from Michelle Sullivan, who says that she's been thinking a lot about the experiences of young people and children. And yeah, I think this is such an interesting question. She was saying, like, you know, what kinds of conditions can we create to support their agency right now? How might we think about like how structures might need to change to support them? So if anyone has thoughts about that, I'd be grateful for them.
I will confess my lack of expertise in the area of children, other than I had a child who is now an adult. But I don't have a lot of experience in that area. I'm actually intrigued as I talk to parents about how they're handling this, what's going to happen next, the disparities in education, just like in healthcare. Michelle actually has way more expertise than I do in this particular area.
Yeah, I know, it's too bad we don't have everyone on video, but.
Yeah.
Matt, what did you say?
I would say the first step in terms of communicating to our kids about something like this, something big like this, it's unprecedented, but we always skip the first step as adults and parents. And the first step is always to ask our kids what questions they have and ask them if they have things they're concerned about or want to know more about. A lot of times adults will like mentally think about the conversation they want to have with their kid and figure out like how to answer those questions, and then they plant questions that the kid didn't have and miss an opportunity to answer the questions the kid actually had. But I also think we're the experts, and so I'm talking about this, the piece of that question that was about communicating with our own kids in a way to help them navigate this difficult moment. We are hopefully the experts on our own kids, and we have to tailor the message to the needs of our individual kids, especially as a function of developmental level. And so I have 2 kids in my house, and I gave very different messages to each kid as a function of their developmental level. So you can look at these articles online where it'll be like, oh, here's how to talk to kids about COVID-19. And it wasn't that they were untrue. It's just that I could not take that and like give that to either of my kids. So I have one high school student who by definition is invincible. And so I mobilized a lot of scary articles and a lot of scary facts. And I tried to like, maybe not terrorize him, but I tried to like really get him to appreciate the importance of this moment and social distancing. And I was like a little more fire and brimstone with him. And I have an elementary school kid, and that conversation was very different, a lot more reassuring and a lot more messages about things we're doing to keep her safe and that we're going to get through this. And there's, you know, really smart people that are helping us, you know, figure out how to navigate this. And so I think titrating that message a little bit as a function of developmental needs and what our kids, and then just in terms of like day-to-day life, structure is critical, you know, like I think it's great. First of all, Albany County School District has been phenomenal, I think, in terms of striking like a really nice balance between not wanting to try to like simulate a school day and have people on computers all day and also not completely checking out. They have structure, they have time to connect via Zoom with friends, they have, you know, lesson plans, but then we also do things as a family. We do some stuff out in nature. So we try to kind of partition our day to make sure that there's structure, but there's also not everything is COVID and not everything is like different world quarantine. We're doing some of the same family things we always did. Other than that, I have no idea.
This is probably good for all of our mental health, right? So sage advice across the board there, Matt. Jess, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, it's just briefly, like shortly to, as a parent who also has like a 7-year-old at home with this, with all of this going around, I'm also, and this goes to like what Matt said with the developmental stuff, I'm always surprised at what kids take in. And also I have clients that are middle schoolers and high schoolers. And I'm always surprised because I feel like we have a pretty transparent conversation. We try to do age appropriate stuff. And then the other day I was singing a song and my 7-year-old recreated the song in his head with words to like COVID-19. Like he created his own song with his own words, like to this other song that I was singing. And I think one thing, and this is like, just goes to my belief in counseling too, is if we create a safe enough container, people will process in their own ways. And the same with, you know, kiddos. Like my son's working it out, singing his COVID-19 songs, right? Like in some ways, and holding space for him. And then I also look at, like, my husband is a teacher in the public school system, and looking at the fact that there are kiddos that don't have that, you know, container right now. And so that's the tricky part, and brings to light, you know, what we had just talked about with the disparities, and how this sort of illuminates how our education system is based on middle class, you know, standards. And so that's a little bit more tricky, right? So we're looking at, like, how are we meeting just base needs and safety for people, for kiddos, and at the same time, in the kiddos that are in the environments that they're in, trying to create space and give them creative ways, and asking them what they know, as Matt said. Like, I was surprised how much my son knew about things that they talked about before spring break. And he's like, here's how I wash my hands now. Here's what I know. And COVID doesn't, you know, impact kids as much as, you know, like all of these things he said that had been ruminating in his head that we didn't always know. Even kids sometimes are like, you know, like being a vet for an animal, like, you can't speak, I can't understand what, you know, and they speak to us in other ways, right? And so how do we pick up on that and hold space for them and that, and
Yeah. It's hard to know how to do all of these things, but Jess, that brings me to sort of just my final point, and we're past our hour, so sorry everyone that we're going a little over time, but a couple people were asking, like, what are ways that we can help and serve right now? April was asking if anyone has a plug for a local nonprofit that might be wanting to take donations, or what is like a concrete or safe way that someone can serve here in Laramie. And then Bruce Richardson up in Casper was also pointing out the ways in which arts groups and so on are being hit really hard right now across Wyoming. So do we have, you know, are there any plugs for any organizations that might really need our help, or ways that we can serve right now?
Well, and I'll jump in. I think the nonprofits are really going to be in a tight spot over the coming 12, 18 months, because even when COVID cases drop, the economic impact is so significant that people will still need food, housing, rent. And there are a couple options. You can certainly give to individual organizations, Interfaith, the Safe House, Soup Kitchen, Downtown Clinic, any of those that are providing that incredible safety net that nonprofits provide in a community. You can also then give to a couple organizations that are supporting those. So United Way of Albany County, I don't know what that's like in other counties in Wyoming for those of you outside of Laramie, but in Albany County, United Way has a COVID-19 fund, and they're distributing it out to all those nonprofits, not just nonprofits who are in the United Way agencies, but any nonprofit. And then the Wyoming Community Foundation also has a fund and doing the same thing. They're giving money out to the nonprofits who are serving. It's harder to volunteer right now, quite frankly, because of the issues with COVID virus. But there are organizations that are still using some volunteers, but a lot of them are not right now because just of the nature of keeping their clients safe, the volunteers safe, and their staff safe. So it's probably a harder time in some respects to volunteer directly in terms of client services, but then there are those places right now, nonprofits that are needing cloth masks, which can be done at home and then Safeway delivered to an appropriate nonprofit. A lot of ways to participate, huge a number of ways to participate in the community.
Absolutely brilliant, and I agree across the board. I would only add two things. I think that was complete and perfect. The one thing I would say is sometimes when there's so much need, it can create a paralysis, and then people don't do anything. And so it's like, wow, there's so many nonprofits, I don't know which one to give to, and then we sit on the fence forever and we don't actually contribute if we have the means to do so. And so the United Way Fund is a great way. It's one-stop shopping to go ahead and make a contribution that then multiple nonprofits in our community can apply for funds for. I would be remiss, though, as a two-time board member of Albany County Safe Project, not to put in a plug for them, because as you guys know, and you probably read a lot of tragic and awful articles about the spike in intimate partner violence and domestic violence, already pandemic levels in our society, and now we have people who are quarantined with some really dangerous situations. So that would be my unique plug, but I do think don't let the abundance of need cause paralysis. Give to a United Way, if nothing else, and then they can allocate as needed.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That's a great note of caution. Jess, anything you want to plug?
I'm leaving it to them.
Okay.
Sake of time. Nice job.
I'm so sorry, you guys. There are so many amazing questions and comments in the chat that we weren't able to get to, but I don't know if the chat like saves as a log, but I highly recommend that if you haven't been looking at the chat, go in and just read through the comments, because people have such amazing contributions to offer. And I was also saying that if anyone has like resources or sources that they want to share with the group that they feel maybe are pertinent to tonight's conversation, please just email them to Scott Henkel. Scott said he would batch things and send them out to the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research listserv. We can share some things on Facebook. So please, you know, continue the conversation, continue sharing, continue reaching out. And yeah, hopefully this will sort of carry us through this next little while. So thank you guys so much. Thank you, Mary, Matt, Jess. You guys are brilliant and wonderful, and we so appreciate your expertise. And thank you everyone so much for coming. This was an incredible turnout and a great conversation, and so grateful to all of you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. Shannon says most of the questions were only visible to the panelists, so maybe what I can do is like copy the whole thing and send to Scott, and if he wants to pull out some comments, he can forward those to everybody over email.
You can save it if you click on those little, mine has little dots on the right hand side of the chat. If you click on that, it'll allow you to save the chat.
Cool, I'm saving the chat.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Be well, take care, have an awesome night, and yeah, enjoy another beverage. We appreciate you guys.
Thanks.
Hey, take care.